She was born under the banners of triumph and hope. Her name whispered through cold stone corridors and candlelit chapels. A daughter to the king's line, a princess wrapped in silks finer than any her nursemaids had ever touched. Her birth was a blessing, they said, a symbol of fortune, peace, and the continuation of the royal bloodline. But behind closed doors, men were already speaking of alliances, treaties, dowries. In the great halls, her mother held her tightly, rocking her in sleepless nights, whispering lullabies. She barely understood herself. But even as the queen gazed at her child's delicate face, she knew this was no ordinary girl. This was a future bride, a promise written in blood and parchment. Her daughter's cradle was not a place of rest, but the first step toward a throne, and all the chains that came with it. The medieval world was not kind to women. It was even less kind to little girls. Here, childhood was short, and innocence was negotiable. Children were pawns in a game they didn't know existed, traded for lands they'd never walk, bound to men they'd never love. The princess was no exception. By the time she could walk, her name was known in courts far beyond her own, a glittering prize, a royal child whose tiny hand could unite kingdoms. She grew up in the shadow of the throne, a life of splendor and suffocation. Gold-threaded gowns, jeweled slippers, polished mirrors, but also strict tutors, endless lessons, cold corridors, and the heavy silence of expectation. She learned to dance before she learned to play. She learned to smile before she learned to laugh. Each step she took was watched. Each word she spoke was weighed outside. The world was rough and hard. Peasant girls her age fetched water from wells, swept floors, tended animals. But inside the castle, her cage was made of velvet. She was guarded like a treasure, locked away from the world she was meant to rule. Her every move watched, her every breath counted. Behind every kind word was an instruction. Behind every gift, an obligation. When she turned 6, the bells rang across the kingdom. Not for her birthday, for her betrothal. The groom was a man of 29, a king in need of an heir, a kingdom in need of stability, and a court eager to see a child princess wed. He rode into the city with banners flying, his soldiers in gleaming armor, his courtiers whispering about his power, his wealth, his ambitions. The streets were lined with people cheering his arrival, tossing flowers at his feet, praising the union that would bring peace between two powerful houses. She watched from the window as the procession arrived. She clutched her doll tightly, the last toy she'd ever hold, and asked her nurse why everyone was cheering. The nurse could only whisper, "It's your wedding day, my sweet." Her small face wrinkled in confusion, but the adults around her smiled, smoothing her hair, adjusting her dress, handing her bouquets she could barely carry. She was dressed in silk, her hair braided with pearls, her small hands folded over embroidered lace. As they led her down the aisle, the crowd marveled at her beauty, her innocence, her grace, as if a child could possess such things. She looked up at the man who would become her husband, her king, her captor, and saw not a lover or a partner, but a stranger who barely met her gaze. She didn't understand the words spoken over her. She didn't understand the contracts signed in her name, the lands exchanged, the alliances forged, but the adults did. They smiled and toasted and called it destiny. The priests blessed the union. The nobles raised their cups. The poets wrote verses of love and unity, none of them glancing at the child beneath the veil. And when the ceremony was over, She was no longer a girl, she was a wife. That night the feast lasted until dawn. There were songs, laughter, wine spilled. On stone floors, nobles boasting of the future, and servants rushing to meet every demand. But in a quiet chamber at the edge of the palace, the child princess sat alone, her wedding dress heavy on her small body, her doll forgotten on the floor, her wide eyes staring into the dark dot. No one came to explain what had happened. No one came to tell her what would come next. She was 6 years old, a wife in name, a prisoner in fact. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, a little girl began to disappear beneath the weight of a crown too heavy for her head. Days passed into weeks. Weeks passed into months. The wedding celebrations faded. The banners were taken down, the songs quieted. But inside the cold stone walls, the child bride remained. She sat in rooms too big for her, on chairs too tall, wearing gowns too heavy for her small shoulders. They called her Your Grace now, but no one asked what she wanted. No one asked if she understood. At court she was a symbol, nothing more. The little queen was shown off at banquets, paraded through gardens, posed for paintings she couldn't sit still for. When visitors came, they admired her beauty, her delicate manners, her wide-eyed silence. Whispers followed her through the halls. Such a pretty child, they murmured, so obedient, a blessing to the kingdom. But beneath the lace and jewels, she remained a girl who missed her mother, her nurse, her familiar rooms, a girl who sometimes cried softly at night, clutching the doll she wasn't supposed to have anymore. A girl who still longed for stories and songs, not treaties and titles. Her husband, the king, was often away, leading campaigns, hunting, holding council, ruling. To him, she was a formality, an asset, a necessary step in securing his reign. On rare days he visited her rooms. He would smile kindly, pat her on the head, perhaps offer her a small trinket, a ring too big for her finger, a pendant too heavy for her neck. And then he would leave, his boots echoing on the stone floor as she watched him go. She was left in the care of the queen's ladies, older women who taught her the ways of court, how to sit, how to pour wine, how to dance gracefully, how to hold her tongue. They dressed her in the fashion of a woman, painted her cheeks, braided her hair into elaborate knots. Sometimes, as they worked on her, they spoke softly to each other, of politics, of war, of births and deaths and marriages, of the queen who was a girl and the girl who was meant to become a queen. Outside the palace, the people whispered to her. Some pitied the child queen, others envied her, but most accepted her fate as normal. A girl was born to marry, to serve, to bear heirs, especially if she was royal, especially if she was useful. The seasons turned. She turned 8, then 9. Her gowns grew longer, her lessons harder. She was taught to read accounts of war, to memorize the names of foreign lords, to smile with grace and keep her eyes lowered. She was still a child, but the court spoke of her as if she were a woman. She will be ready soon, they said. The kingdom needs an heir. At 10, her mother, the woman who had once rocked her to sleep, died of fever. The little queen was led into the chapel, her face pale beneath her veil, to stand beside the coffin. She didn't cry. She wasn't allowed. By 12, her body began to change, and with it, the expectations. The whispers grew louder. The court watched her carefully now. The king visited more often. The ladies prepared her chambers, her bed. The midwives and healers were called to examine her, to declare her ready. ready to become not just a wife in name, but in full, ready to bear children. She did not understand, or perhaps she understood too well. One night, when the moon hung pale and cold above the palace, she was led to the king's rooms. Her hands trembled as the ladies undressed her, murmuring words of comfort that felt like betrayal. She was 12, and they told her it was time to be a wife, time to be a mother. When dawn came, she lay still in the vast bed, staring at the carved ceiling, her small body curled under heavy blankets. Outside, the palace stirred to life, servants rushing, lords preparing for council, the king rising for another day of rule. Inside, the little queen felt something inside her crack. The weeks that followed were a blur. Congratulations whispered in hallways, prayers offered at chapels, midwives summoned to check, to prod, to confirm, and soon the news spread. The child queen was with child. She was 13, barely past her 12th year, and they called it a miracle. But for her, it was something else entirely. The next chapter in a life she had never chosen, a life written for her by men, by custom, by a crown too heavy for her head. Months passed in a haze of whispers, preparations, and prayers. The child queen, now 13, moved through the palace like a ghost wrapped in silk. Her belly swelled beneath embroidered gowns. Her steps slowed, her nights grew restless. The court marveled at her, the miracle queen, the girl who would bring an heir into the world. But inside her chambers, it was a different story. Alone with her ladies, she trembled with fear. She was too young to understand what was happening to her body, yet too old to avoid knowing the whispers that followed her. She must be strong. She must give us a son. She must not fail. The midwives measured her, touched her, murmured to each other in corners. The older women in the court shook their heads in secret, remembering other child brides, other doomed queens. But none dared speak aloud. At night, she clutched her sheets, fighting waves of nausea, her small hands pressed over her belly as if to hold herself together. She missed her mother, the one person who might have soothed her, explained things gently, stood between her and the crushing demands of the throne. But her mother was gone, and around her stretched only cold stone walls and faces trained to smile but never comfort. As her 14th birthday passed, the preparations intensified. Priests came to bless her rooms. Physicians arrived with herbs and tonics. The cradle was prepared, an ornate wooden cradle, gilded with gold, placed in her chamber as a constant reminder. This was her duty. This was why she existed. And then, one night, it began. It started as an ache, low in her back, sharp across her belly. She tried to walk, then doubled over, gasping. The ladies rushed to her side. The king was called, then sent away. The midwives took over, shooing servants from the room, bolting the doors, laying out cloths, bowls of water, instruments she didn't recognize. The pain built slow, relentless, like a tide she could not escape. She cried out, clutching the bedposts, her small body racked with agony. The women around her whispered, prayed, barked orders. Hours passed. Dawn broke. Still, the child queen labored. She was 14, fighting a battle no girl should ever have to face. Her body was too small, her bones too narrow, her strength fading with each contraction. Her cries echoed through the palace, muffled only by heavy doors and the hands of nervous attendants. Outside, the court waited, counting the hours, speculating. Will it be a boy? Will both survive? Will the kingdom rejoice or mourn? Inside, time blurred. She faded in and out, sweating, trembling, weeping. The midwives worked desperately, urging her to push, to hold on, to survive. They whispered prayers under their breath, crossing themselves when they thought she couldn't see. But she saw. She saw their fear. She felt their panic. And somewhere inside, she understood. By nightfall, she was too weak to cry out anymore. The baby, they said, was almost here, but her body was broken. Her face was pale, her eyes half closed, and then, finally, a thin, piercing cry. A child was born. The midwives lifted the baby, a boy wrapped in linen, and for a moment the room sighed in relief. An heir, a son, a kingdom secured. But when they turned back to the little queen, she was slipping away. Her pulse faltered, her breath shallow. The women surrounded her, calling her name, begging her to stay. But she was gone, or almost gone, drifting beyond their reach. She was 14, a mother, a wife, a queen, and now a shadow. Outside, the bells began to ring. Across the city, people celebrated a son, an heir, a future for the realm. Wine flowed in the streets. Songs filled the night air. The court rejoiced inside, in a quiet chamber away from the cheers and the prayers. The little queen lay still in her bed, her face turned to the wall, her body exhausted, her spirit flickering. Like a candle in the dark dot. No one spoke of the girl behind the heir, the child behind the crown, the mother behind the triumph. Not then. Not now, and in the night, as the palace danced and the kingdom feasted. The little queen closed her eyes and slipped away into history, into silence, into the long, unbroken line of forgotten girls who had borne the weight of the world, only to vanish before anyone learned their names. Dawn broke over the palace, spilling pale light across stone towers, sweeping through stained glass windows, glinting off golden crests. In the grand halls, nobles gathered in their finest clothes, offering congratulations, raising goblets, praising. The birth of a prince. A future king had arrived. A kingdom had been secured. But in the small, quiet chamber where the little queen had labored, there was no celebration, only silence. Only the still figure of a girl, pale as the linens wrapped around her, her hands folded over her chest, her eyes closed. 14 years old, a wife, a mother, and now a corpse. They prepared her body with careful hands, bathing her gently, dressing her in a gown of white and gold, weaving tiny flowers through her hair. The same hair they had braided on her wedding day, the same small hands they had folded in marriage vows, now folded in death. The priest arrived, murmuring prayers, swinging incense over the bed. The queen's ladies wept quietly, but only briefly, for they had duties to tend, and grief was a luxury in the royal court. Outside, the king received his lords, accepting praise for the healthy air. A few spoke in hushed tones of the queen's passing, but not for long. There were alliances to confirm, lands to secure, plans to be made. Another bride would be found in time. The kingdom moved forward, and the little queen, she was laid too. Rest in the royal tomb, beneath a marble effigy carved in her likeness, though the sculptor made her older, more womanly, fitting her title rather than her truth. Her name was inscribed alongside the kings and queens of the realm, but her story faded quickly, swallowed by the weight of history. The chronicles recorded the birth of the heir. They recorded the reign of the king. But the girl queen, the child bride, the young mother who died before her 15th year, she became a footnote, a line in a dusty ledger, a face on a crumbling tomb. And she was not alone. Across medieval Europe, girls like her were married young, some at 12, some at 10, some even younger. Royal daughters were pawns in a game of dynasties, traded like jewels, valued for the lands they could bring, the heirs they could bear. Few questioned it, fewer resisted it, and fewer still remembered the cost. Some girls survived, living long, but loveless lives, growing into queens who wielded quiet power from behind veils and thrones. Others, like the little queen, were broken by the system meant to elevate them, crushed under the weight of pregnancies their bodies could not bear, silenced by the expectations of courts that valued them only when they produced sons, and history. History rarely spoke their names. Today, when we walk through ancient castles, when we visit cathedrals lined with effigies, when we read the chronicles of kings and kingdoms, we rarely pause to wonder who were the girls behind the crowns. What did they dream? What did they fear? What did they lose? The little queen's story lingers, not in the pages of history books, but in the quiet spaces, in the empty cradles, in the faded tapestries, in the cold, lifeless hands folded in marble. Her voice is gone, but her shadow remains, whispering through the centuries. She was 6 when she was married, 14 when she gave birth, 15 when she died. She was a wife, a mother, a queen. But before all of that, she was a girl, and maybe, if we listen closely, we can still hear her. Not as a symbol, not as a queen, but as a child whose life was traded for power, whose death was buried under politics, whose name was lost to time, but whose story still matters. She was one among many, and through remembering her, we remember them all. Music fades into silence,